Hello, and thank you for coming. My name's Ruth McCambridge. I am the Director of Content here at the Nonprofit Financial Commons. Also, I'm going to just mention this today, one of the founders, and I'm mentioning that because this particular project that we're concluding today, and of course it'll never be concluded, but the one that we're having the final session for today has been in the works and being presented to you virtually since we started. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Before we go on, I just want to say that we're very lucky to have a sponsor for this session, which means that we can bring it to you for free. And today, the sponsor for this session is actually another organization that has been involved with us since the very beginning of our even thinking about the nonprofit commons, and that is Jitasa. Jitasa is a bookkeeping, accounting, and fractional CFO service provider that works exclusively with nonprofits. Their team serves over 1,500 organizations across the nation and has helped nonprofits organize their finances since 2008. Jitasa is committed to helping nonprofits that are dedicated to making the world a better place, and their team truly understands the unique challenges faced by these noble organizations. Whether you need help filing your annual 990, organizing your grant funding, ensuring your revenue and expenses are properly recorded, or any other financial service, Jitasa can help. Please visit jitasa.com. That's JITASA.com for more information. Okay, so I'm going to take a little more of your time than we usually take at the beginning of these sessions, just to remind those of you that haven't been through many of the other business model sessions what it is that we're doing here. This is a final session in our first full course of study at the Nonprofit Financial Commons. The course is called The 5 Most Common Nonprofit Business Models, made up of sessions to explore the specific characteristics and requirements of your predominant streams of revenue. That's how we trace your business model, is through your predominant streams of revenue. And as we go on today, you're going to understand how important that actually is in terms of ways to trace things. In each of these sessions, as Hilda will later explain, we have explored, for instance, the administrative structures, risks, and leadership requirements of each of these 5 types of revenue. We've discussed the degree of organizational autonomy each stream affords you and the ways they affect your capital structures and flows. But the real brilliance of this course is that all of this knowledge that we are presenting to you has actually come from you who work with this complexity day to day. So this is knowledge that we know in the field, but has never kind of been codified because it's not seen, basically. It's not acknowledged. In other words, the information is not comprehensively written down for serious leaders to access, maybe because to date, this realm of the economy, nonprofits, has functioned largely in the shadow of the dominant for-profit economy. But nonprofit leaders function to a different bottom line or bottom lines in sectors that are affected by everything from local to national politics, the distribution of wealth in the country, the collective priorities of our constituents, and a host of other wicked issues. But if there is one thing we know, it is that nonprofits learn the necessary disciplines associated with the money they use very quickly. They pick it up from one another. And this is an attempt to formalize that process. So in this course, we have reflected the knowledge that is held in each of your heads about what each kind of money requires and creates here in a single course. So if you haven't visited our business model course on our website, make sure you do that soon because it'll fill out kind of the precursors to this particular session. Since we started, we've asked you questions at every turn, asked you to tell us your stories and your practices. That all of that with the research that does exist on these issues and tried to reveal the patterns of change and challenge and opportunity that exist with every stream. This course then is a reflection of the real challenges that exist for nonprofit financial leaders and managers. And in codifying all of this, we hope to make it easier for ourselves and those who come behind us to manage these very challenging organizations well. What is important to take away is that this knowledge framework we've developed has been built through the hard-won trial and error of hundreds of thousands of nonprofits. It belongs to no single entity, but is an NFC curated gift from our peers to our peers. It is in no small part a building block for what up until now has been an under-recognized profession. We intend over time to continue to work on this framework, and we encourage you to let us know if you be a part of that. We will. There's any number of questions that we have left untortured, and we're going to take those up over time. Now on to today's session. In this final piece of the course, we will be taking on some relatively new material in looking at what you might want to consider when looking at adding or indeed even subtracting from your revenue mix. One is as important as the other. I don't mind telling you that it took a little while to put this all together, but what we have for you today is the scaffolding for a new decision-making framework that can be used by most nonprofits to consider not just how to bring in additional revenue, but what kind of revenue exactly they most need to make their organization work better. Hilda's going to describe this with all of her skill and insight in a few minutes. Going on to the new slide, that's great. We are lucky today to be joined by some of our many partners, including Hilda and the team at BDO, which have been our co-developers throughout this course. And we are incredibly grateful for their intellectual partnership. It's been a wonderful experience. But we also today have Mark Hager, who is one of the moderators at Nonprofit Financial Commons. But he's also, in his spare time, one of the best known academic research on the topic of revenue diversification. We also welcome Michael Anderson and Jen Mitzler, who have actually put a framework of this type to work in the trenches. And then Dana Brito, another of our moderators, who will talk about the elements of the business of business model planning. And then we have you, our community of practice. And just to remind you, as we do every time, you have been absolutely central to us being able to put this model together to recognize the patterns that we work with every day and the complexities that are kind of a part of making sense of nonprofit finance. Please use the chat liberally. You can register a question at any point during this presentation. We have 2 question and answer periods that will be posing some questions to the presenters. And so I'll be looking at your questions, both the ones you submitted in advance of this session and the ones that we get in the chat during this session. During those periods. Also, I want to encourage everybody, as you always do, if you know the answer to somebody else's question, please feel free to answer their question. That's what this is all about. We know that the expertise and the knowledge is in those people who have experience in working with the concepts, ideas, and realities in their particular organization. So please help each other out. With that, I'm going to hand this over to Hilda, my partner,
Thank you.
who is going to help us kind of get present with a poll.
Thank you, Ruth, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure, as Ruth said, to have been a part of this program. And today is a bit of a graduation. So thank you for joining us. As always, we really want to know who's in the room with us. So if you would please join me for a few polls to have a sense as to our attendees today. So Amanda, if you would please launch this poll, please share with us what your organization's expense budget is for the year. And so you can see we have 4 categories here for you. Please tell us what your operating expense budget is. And Amanda, I will leave it to you to publish the results when you think you have the right level of response. Okay, so I always find it really fascinating that our attendees are somewhat of a bell curve. So you can see about 19% are under 250, with about 27% 250 to $1 million, 38% between 1 and 5 million, and 16% of you are over 5 million in operating expense. We find that budget size is an indicator of activity, but oftentimes all organizations of different sizes are really learning and sharing ideas all at the same time. So in terms of mission area, we are really generous here in terms of the options we're giving you. I won't read every single one out. I'd like you to find the one that most closely reflects your mission. And you'll see in a minute that we are sharing what's been published previously with respect to funding sources that typically fund particular mission areas. So we're trying to go on this journey with you in terms of your mission area. And soon I'll ask you a little bit more about your primary sources of funding. So please let us know of these 11 options, which of these options most closely reflects who you are as an organization. We realize some of you may be multi-service. Just what you think most closely resembles your mission. Okay, I won't read every answer, but you can see here, and the poll is a little bit longer because we have so many potential answers. Definitely see education and youth, social services being significant, and really a nice spread across many, many aspects of our sector. Thank you so much for doing that. And then the next question here for you is, what is your primary revenue source? Individual, institutional funders, and we placed United Way in that category, along with foundations and corporations. Is it government? That earned revenue? Primary. So you may have multiple, and after today, you might decide that you have even a broader array. But today, what is your primary source of revenue? Individuals, etc. So be thinking, what's your primary? I am going to ask you something else about your revenue sources in my next and last poll. And so here we are, primary sources of revenue. Okay, institutional and government almost tied for first place among the callers here today. Next with individuals, and then earned revenue, a little bit of membership. Thank you so much. And keeping that in mind, how you answered the question with respect to your primary source of revenue, is your primary revenue source aligned with most others in your sector? You might say, well, I'm not sure who else is in my sector and what their sources of revenue. Or you might say, oh, I really know the area that we are in. I know my mission area, and I know that others in my type of work are also seeing the same primary source of revenue. So just your best guess. Is it the same as your primary? Is it the well-recognized source of revenue for this mission that you're in? Maybe not. Maybe you realize you have a unique business model with a unique revenue model, or you may not be sure. Okay, about 50% of you know for sure. that yes, you are consistent with your peers, and almost the same aren't sure, and then a few of you know for sure that you're not. We ask these questions just to get you thinking about your model and the fact that we are all part of a bigger sector. This was published by NPQ some years back. We've used it previously. I think it was in our very first session. And you can see, and you'll have copies of these slides. We realize there's a lot going on this slide. But you can see with the federal government, for example, lots of dollars coming in from that source. Program fees and private sources, sort of the largest. And you can see how each of the mission areas is funded. We hope that you will come back to this slide, and gives you a sense at a sector level where government is going and where individuals tend to cover. I'd like to pass the virtual baton to Mark now, who has some thoughts from his work in the field.
Thank you, Hilda, and hello to all of you out there in Zoom land. I'm coming to you from my home office in Houston, Texas, where we are still recovering from Hurricane Beryl glancing across us this past couple of days. I was just able to get my internet access back early this morning, just in time to come in and chat with you today. As Ruth said, I'm one of the NFC moderators. My pro gig is research on various aspects of nonprofit organizations and the nonprofit sector. I left my tenured faculty position 2 years ago to focus on research and things I really want to do, like work with the nonprofit financial commons. Nonprofit finance has been I just say a periodic focus of mine, because I'm interested in lots of things related to the operation of nonprofit organizations. But as I was preparing my thoughts for this today, I recalled one particular moment in the spring of 2000. I can actually remember the desk I was sitting at the time. I was reading and doing a critical review of an article by colleagues that had introduced me to the idea that diversification or concentration of revenue types might influence the fates of nonprofits. Now, I already knew about revenue streams and where do you get your money from. That's something I'd been paying some attention to, but this idea of diversification or concentration, how much of what kinds of revenue streams do you have? What combinations do you have was new to me. And that's the topic that we're trying to delve into a little bit more in our webinar today. That idea back then in the spring of 2000 just kind of hit me between the eyes, and I immediately incorporated the idea of revenue diversification into an analysis I was doing at the time of the financial vulnerability of nonprofit arts organizations. And that's an old paper nobody wants to read, but if I'm going to refer to some things, I can at least drop some things into the chat here as I do it. So there's a link dropped into the chat. But after I'd written that, my attention turned again. I continued to look at finance, but my attention turned to the study of cost allocations at the time. And I generally lost track of the thread on revenue diversification for a number of years. You can fast forward, geez, more than a decade, maybe more like 15 years, when a young colleague approached me and said, hey, while you weren't paying attention to this, a lot of researchers have been publishing research on the influence of revenue diversification on various aspects of nonprofit management or nonprofit behavior. He told me they were doing with the diversity of approaches and they were arriving at a variety of conflicting results. And he suggested that this was a rabbit hole that he and I could go down together. And so we started doing that. Hilda, go to slide 2 here, and you'll see that we did with something called a meta-analysis, which you can sort of think of as a study of studies. This project allowed me to dig back into the topic of revenue diversification. In this project, we located 40 different studies that reported statistical relationships between some measure of revenue stream diversification and something that could be framed as financial health. I'll drop that link in here as well. The important thing to take away from that paper was just sort of a summary statistic that got us going on this project. The tables that we report in that study showed we went through these 40 papers and we pulled out the 296 statistical tests that are reported in those 40 papers that look at the relationship between revenue stream diversification or concentration and some dimension of financial health. And we found in 142 of those cases, there was a positive relationship, meaning having a diversified revenue stream was a good thing for the financial health of the organization. In 31 cases, there was no relationship, and in 123, there was a negative relationship, meaning the more diversified your revenues, the poorer your financial health. So this gives us the basis to use these particular results for the analysis that you can get in that particular paper. I don't suggest anybody read it. We went to the Nonprofit Quarterly. Go to the next slide here, Hilda. And let's see, there's a link that I can do to that Nonprofit Quarterly article here, where we were less interested in reporting out the results on that article and more on summarizing the arguments that people make on why diversification or concentration of revenue streams might matter or might not matter, might be good, might be bad. And we can start out with these, you might call them pro arguments. And these are the ones usually here. The first one might even be called a textbook argument that you've likely heard before about why you, Mr. or Mrs. Nonprofit organization, ought to diversify your revenue streams. And that's because sooner or later, something's going to change. Could be a hurricane, could be that a donor just decides to give to somebody else. And the question is, what do you do when something big changes? If you only rely on one revenue stream and it disappears, then you're in trouble. If you have various streams, you can lean more on stream B or stream C when stream A goes through that period of uncertainty. There's also an argument about autonomy. This is the question of whether you have the freedom to pursue your own mission or if you're just vending the mission of others, carrying out the mission of others. In this case, autonomy is thought of as a good thing. If you're relying on a single source, and especially particular single sources, this can be pretty limiting for you. Government contracts in particular are notorious for robbing nonprofits of their own decision-making. And the argument is that if you added grants, or if you added individual gifts, or a social enterprise, that might give you more ability to call your own shots mission-wise. A third argument people make is about exposure in the community, sometimes called the social capital argument. The idea is that the more community stakeholders know about you, the better. If all of your money comes from big foundation grants, then government agencies don't know about you. Individual mover donors in the community might not ever hear about you, and they never therefore get the opportunity to learn about you and maybe support you in some way. But developing more income streams means developing more audiences, which is exposure and social capital. So it's not surprising to hear these pro arguments out there. Be diversified, be diversified, be diversified. But Hilda, slide 4 here is con arguments. Like I said, when we look at these studies that people have done on this topic, they're often finding negative relationships between diversification and the financial health of organizations. But you hear less about these kinds of arguments out in the consultant sphere. There are downsides, or at least potential downsides to revenue diversification. One is that every revenue venture carries elements of risk. So adding revenue streams multiplies your exposure to risk, and risk is that thing that can increase your chances of failure. A second argument has to do with crowd out of donations. The argument here is that prospective donors evaluate what you're doing and make their giving decisions accordingly. So when you make a change, they might make a change. There's my timer. Let me turn it off. An example here, a favored donor who routinely gives an annual $20,000 gift, but then she reads in the newspaper that you've landed a $4 million government contract. Her reaction to that might be, well, they don't need my money. I'll give it to the opera this year instead. So your pursuit of that government contract might result in the crowding out of donations. A third issue here is increased administrative costs. There's going to be risks, and there are going to be administrative outputs and anything new that you create. And you have new processes, you might have new software, you might have new staff. That's going to create management issues that some people might not want to have, but there's also the danger of escalating non-program costs. And sadly, donors may take escalating administrative costs as inefficiencies that lead them to not donate or otherwise fund your work. Let me go quickly to the next slide here, Hilda. There's an article here that we'll refer to a few times today, recently published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review by our friends at the Bridgespan Group. When I read this article, my takeaway point was that they find the big organizations that they study tended to rely mostly on a single revenue stream. And so that argues strongly for concentration of revenues. There are 3 other takeaways that you'll hear about in the webinar today, and then I'll pass the torch to Hilda. One is they suggest you focus on concentration in 1 or 2 revenue categories. Don't go scattershot. You just open yourself up to some of those cons that we were talking about. Secondly, seek funding that's a natural match to your organization's work. And thirdly, get really good at making these work for you. You become more efficient, you be more effective in carrying out those particular revenue streams if you focus on the things that are good for you. Those are my remarks. Let me pass the torch back to Hilda here. I'll return in just a bit with her for some of your Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark. And you'll see that we go back to our previous framework for this program, which is we identified these 5 sources of revenue and thought of them as revenue models that really frame the way organizations manage and plan for their future. And there were certain considerations that we've been looking at. Mark had some comments on, and you'll see from today's presentation and voice from the field how this really is playing out when we think about the revenue analysis. There are a few considerations that I'll go through as a framing perspective, and then I will walk through how these considerations apply to each of the sources of funding and how I'd like you to think about them as you're exploring either deepening or expanding into other sources. So first and foremost, who is paying and for what? When we're thinking about that particular source of revenue, who is that source? What are the risks, to Mark's points earlier? What are the sensitivities? What are the challenges associated with that type of funding? What is the leadership capacity? What is the orientation? And you'll find in just a little bit that as we look at what are the major takeaways from some of these funding source perspectives, the leadership capacity is a really important aspect. And you might think, well, strong leader is a strong leader. There's actually characteristics that lend themselves more to specific types of revenue for deeper success. And I'll go into those as well. And then lastly, what are the infrastructure needs? We at BDO work with organizations to help them build the infrastructure they need to successfully diversify or manage those revenues that they have been able to accumulate. So what are those? And they are definitely different across multiple sources of revenue in terms of what needs to be prioritized. So come with me on this journey across these 5 sources of revenue, and I will frame these in a similar way throughout. What are those characteristics down the left? What are the specific answers to those characteristics as it relates to each of these sources? I'm starting with individual. And at the end, I will highlight the lessons from the field based on all of the sessions that we've done. Again, 6, including today, the field conversations we've had. We've had voices from the field in each particular revenue webinar. What is the one takeaway that we would want you to take? So as I go through this, let me focus on individuals. So these are individual donors. We find that the leadership capabilities, when I think of sensitivities, leadership capabilities or infrastructure, really important if you're thinking of moving into the individual donor space, that the leadership capacities are critical to position the organization as visible and effective. So it's a storytelling relationship. It's a relationship with our donors for them to understand what we are delivering and what our impact is. In terms of the lessons from the field that we've captured in our time together, one key takeaway is what I have here around the CRM infrastructure that is necessary. If you're attempting to grow or deepen the individual fundraising with individual donors, do you have the right databases to stay connected, to communicate, and do you have the automated processing for that communication? That becomes really, really key. And we saw that in some of the questions that we had at the beginning. As we move into foundations, the sensitivities, risks, and challenges are around shifts in funder priorities. Mark alluded to that before. There's an possible over-reliance on a single foundation, and that has its risks as well. There are some leadership capacities unique to foundation, and some, of course, the infrastructure needs around the grant cycle and understanding the opportunities. In this particular case as well, the leadership capacities we think are key. And so in trying to seek foundation funding, we want to have the capabilities to employ innovative, influential, persuasive strategies. It's about speaking of your outcome in terms that foundations will understand. It's a question of access in the foundation world, understanding the funding landscape, understanding how what relationships need to be critical in particular foundations in order to make this possible. So again, if this is an area you're looking to go into, how can you strengthen those capabilities to be in the most successful position? Lessons from the field, as we have here, developing the systems that allow you to show your outcomes, that show your ability to track and ability to plan on a multi-year basis. You may have a major donor that asks for a multi-year plan. Less common. Foundations, really critical. If you wish to ask for multi-year grants, you need to be able to tell your multi-year story. And so having that muscle has shown to be a key to success from our work with various leaders. Government. We saw that government and foundations were tied for first place in primary sources of revenue. So many of you are actually thinking about the impact of government. Sensitivities, you can see the world we're living in today. We understand the risks of being heavily government funded in terms of changes in administration. With the leadership capacities, understanding the political instincts and mobilizing from an advocacy perspective to influence that agenda at the national, state, or local level. Infrastructure needs, we know that government equates with administrative burdens, delayed payments, working capital, long-term in nature, often renewable, very, very key that we understand what happens at the political level or at the government level outside of our control. And so understanding that things might change, that we may not have as much control as we maybe have with individuals or foundations, that becomes really critical. And then lastly, from the government perspective, lessons from the field, really understanding your indirect cost rate, which is a major source of revenue recovery, having the mechanisms for cost allocations, telling your story down to a contract level, understanding the policies for compliance that government requires. It's a culture almost of compliance if government becomes your primary source, or it's your second or third. It's one where there is no room to do business with government unless you have the working capital and you have the systems that I'm referring to. As I move into earned revenue, on the earned revenue side, remember, those are goods and services that are for sale. And on the sensitivity front, we're looking at market challenges. We're looking at supply chain, customer service. You're almost a business in the business of selling. And so that capacity becomes critical, understanding your market, understanding what it means to create this business and bring it to bear. And on an infrastructure level, we see the need and importance on that business planning capacity, on being able to price your services and being able to have this be revenue and not a negative expense because we have, or a net expense because we haven't priced it properly. So what are the lessons from the field as it relates to successes? Infrastructure, business planning capacity. If you're planning to grow on an earned revenue, you need to be able to understand the business. You need to be able to plan for it, price it, and have the systems to support the actual revenue generation and monitoring. Last but not least, I saw that was the smallest of all of the primary sources of revenue here. Membership is around relationships. It's about that deep sense of purpose and that deep connection to what brings us all together for a common goal. Governance, if you were with us for the membership session, it became clear that clarity around the governance structure and the organizational decision making, if we're going to have a membership revenue source that's significant, how do members come together and how do we give them an opportunity for involvement? I realize this is a lot to think about as you're with us today and taking this with you. This summary that I walked you through is part of a chart that has been built with lots more detail. It's on the website. It's part of the course curriculum. And I encourage you all to visit and really looked more deeply into which source it is that you might be pursuing in the future. My last point that I want to make around the sort of how we think about the diversification. We often think about sources of revenue and we think about, well, what is the diversification of the revenue? And we say, well, we have 30% foundation, 65% government, 5% individual. That's the composition of our revenue. And that's in fact one way to think about it. We worked with an organization or with a funder who had a grantee that had very similar ratio percentage. And in their mind, government funding, 65%, we understand that to be highly restricted, but they have 35% that's unrestricted. So, okay, that's a nice balance. What wasn't considered in that analysis was that foundation funding was also heavily restricted. So we were really looking at 95% restricted, 5% unrestricted. We want to maybe think of other scenarios. In another scenario, we could have a foundation grant that's restricted, government grant that's restricted. We might have another source of revenue that is restricted, maybe major donor, and we could have 89% restricted and only 11 unrestricted. So when you think of revenue diversification on the left, and really the focus of a lot of our observations today, that's one way to look at it. I encourage you as you budget and you plan for the future to also look at revenue restriction. So once we know where the sources are coming from, what are the restrictions associated with those sources? So that then we know about flexibility and we know about availability of dollars for decisions that may come your way that you may not necessarily have planned in the budget. So we look at sources, we look at the restrictions associated with them. I'd like to now pass the baton to our Q&A section, which Ruth is going to moderate for us. And I know questions were previously sent. Questions might have come in during the session today. And Mark and I would be happy to address any questions that you've identified, Ruth.
Yeah, it's been so interesting to watch the chat. Whoops. You guys can't see.
There she is.
It's sorry. It's been so interesting to watch the chat because basically what I've seen is people are kind of are struggling with definitional things like when does a government grant become earned income, when is it when is it grant income, you know, like and how much of a difference does that make, and what do we do about the enormous diversity within single categories. You know, is that diversification in fact? Like basically people are saying, how do we make these distinctions between categories? And you can have government grants that have very, very different levels of compliance requirements, and one thing and another. How do you recommend that people really, you know, draw those lines? And I'm going to ask this one of Hilda, because Hilda has seen just about every, you know, nuance of funding that there is. And people very often will struggle even within a single category of funding because those categories require very different things of you. The elements of the category require different things of you. Can you talk a little bit about kind of administrative loads, risk loads, even within a single category? And kind of talk a little bit about the difference between diversifying between channels and streams and diversifying within a stream.
So that's a great point, that diversification can happen across and within. And what I would say is diversification within. So we might have federal government, state government, local government. The major umbrella is government. And even though those expectations might be different by level, there's a certain level of characteristic for that type of revenue. And so when we're thinking about across, I would want us to think about what are the major expectations from that area. And so if I'm going down the government route, I need to be thinking working capital, compliance, pricing, etc. If I go now deeper from the federal government, once it goes to the state, once it goes to the city, every extra layer means more administration. So you can expect federal dollars that have been passed through to a city agency to be the most restricted ever, because they've inherited all of those restrictions. So when we're thinking from that perspective, we're trying to understand sort of the depth of it. I'm going to come back in one way to that. As we go across, once you diversify out and sorry, let me go back to government. The skill sets are similar, that for your staff, government grant writing, compliance, etc. As we go across, and now we say, well, we want to diversify into foundations, the skill sets necessary for foundation grants are very different. And so when we go across, the first thing to think about is how do we build that new skill? Because inevitably it will be different than the other area that you're doing business in. So what are the human capital skills that we need? What are the other aspects that we need to basically build? And one of the reasons I think that Mark's research showed that diversification sometimes was actually hurtful is that it's very hard for an organization to build all of the capacities that it needs to meet all of its masters, if you will. And so there is that limit as to when is it riskier to go into more sources than actually deepening in the 2 or 3. I hope that helps, Ruth.
Yeah. Again, I'm gonna, somebody asked, oh, what do you mean? Can you give some examples of increasing your risk through diversifying your income streams? And I'd love both of you to answer this.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I see Doran asking that a couple of times here, and I was gonna react to that in the chat here in a few minutes, but not with much detail, sorry to say. It's an argument that's made, and I was looking at my NPQ article that I referred to that's linked there as well. And on page 58 are my 4 paragraphs where I sort of summarize that argument as best I can. The argument comes from references to modern portfolio theory, which suggests that the more complicated your portfolio is, the more risk you create. And then risk then translates into the potential for failures of various sorts. So I won't elaborate on the argument more than that. It has to do with complexity bringing risk and risk being linked to failure. It doesn't have to, but that's what the argument is.
Hilda, how about you?
I think it's this idea of the more that you attempt to build, the greater the chances that you will weaken what you have. So for example, if we are asking our program staff to begin an earned revenue strategy, to start an enterprise, can that individual continue to carry their programmatic load that's funded by foundations, let's say, or government, and also start a business? If we are using the same resources that we have and trying to build skills to go across the multiple sources, that it's a risk. If you have been accustomed to doing business with funders that pay you in advance, like foundations or individuals, and now you diversify into government, the risk is that you may not fully understand that you need working capital in advance. So the risk comes from going into the unknown. It's not to say it shouldn't be done, but to go into the unknown means you need to understand what needs to change in order to be successful.
And that I think the other point is, in fact, what you're going into may fail. Just because you think it looks like a natural revenue source for you doesn't mean it's going to work that way. And so there's, you may be sinking money into a failed endeavor, and I think that our next presentation is going to be able to talk more to that, is how do you actually make those decisions about, does this make sense for us to take on as a new diversification strategy? I do want to say, just moving out of the questioner role for a minute, that there's some research out there that says organizations tend to be more diverse when they start up than when they get older, because I think over time you begin to realize this, what the SSIR article calls the natural match, the value of the natural match when a type of organization is really funded in a particular way, that there's an extra lift there for you. Where if you're a younger organization, you haven't yet figured out how to optimize that, you may be trying out more things because they're there to be tried out. So I'm going to move now and hand this over to Michael Anderson, and he will introduce Jenny Mitzler.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. Good to be with you all today. I'm going to spend 5-6 minutes introducing a simple framework that we use with our nonprofit clients that are exploring how to optimize their income mix. And we use this phrase of optimizing your income mix really intentionally. If you could go to the next slide, Hilda. It is really not about maximizing, not just about diversifying for the sake of diversifying, but having organizational leaders, having nonprofit leaders think about optimizing as finding and maintaining the right mix of resources to support your mission delivery and to support your organizations. And that question of what is our optimal income mix is a fundamentally strategic question. It really implies we as nonprofit leaders can take an active role that is responsive to the environment around us. It's different than this often entrenched mindset in the sector of we will take what we can get and make the work happen. It really is a more proactive financial strategy question. And just to place financial strategy in the context of other organizational strategy and planning conversations, if you could advance, please, Hilda. We see financial strategy as sitting at the intersection of organizational strategy and financial planning, and is an often missed gap of conversations and discussions that happen in quote unquote strategic planning or quote unquote business planning conversations, where we miss a conversation around financial strategy when bridging from the high level elements of organizational strategy and moving into financial planning and multi-year financial projections. I'll pull out, you've heard a couple times the recent SSIR article reference here. There was a quote from an interviewee in that bridge span study that was published last month that said, some time ago we figured out what we do really well and who would pay for it. I love the simplicity of that quote, and it's emblematic of the point on differentiating strengths as being a core component of your organizational strategy, is understanding what it is that you do really well, so that you can then move into some of your programmatic strategy, operational strategy, and financial strategy considerations. So I'll briefly outline this simple framework that we often use with nonprofits that explores 4 different dynamics to consider when thinking about your income types. So these 4 are autonomy, reliability, administrative burden, or opportunity. So when I use income types here, I'm thinking about, I think consistent with how other speakers today have talked about streams. So not necessarily single sources, but the buckets or the pools or the streams or the types of income, and gathering together with leaders from your organizations to assess those different income types across these 4 dynamics. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those assessment criteria for each of these 4 of autonomy, reliability, administrative burden, and opportunity. There are times that we might take I'll say one more thing on how we set up this assessment exercise. There are times we might take one type of income in a particular organization's context. It might make great sense to separate it. So whereas sometimes we think about institutional philanthropy as a type of income, well, your foundation contributions and your corporate grants might measure really differently across these dynamics. And so we separate those out. Same is true if you have federal grants from different federal agencies or state grants from different state agencies. Sometimes it merits pulling those apart into smaller buckets to get to the level of analysis that you need when using this framework. So I'll talk really briefly about each of these 4 and just the kind of considerations to have in mind when doing this assessment. So on autonomy, and I'll give a quick reference to it's 20 years old now. John Pratt wrote an article in the Nonprofit Quarterly on the autonomy reliability matrix, and this really builds from that 20-year-old. I think we consider that a classic piece now on assessing autonomy and reliability. But some of the questions you might consider when thinking about assessing autonomy is really, does this income type allow us to pursue our strategic priorities in the way that we best know how to do so? The way Mark put earlier was that it's about our mission or their mission, sometimes what that comes down to. And this is meant to be a conversation that assess those different types, or maybe sometimes pull outs of those different types of income and coming to some shared understanding of, on a 1 to 10 scale, the different levels of autonomy certain income types afford. The second characteristic of reliability, sometimes it's all about predictability and likelihood. Is this a one-time shoot the moon opportunity, or is this potentially a new ongoing source? Another way we often think about this is, does this income type contribute to organizational stability, or is it likely to lead to future organizational operational disruption because of its unpredictability or unlikelihood to recur? The third dynamic of administrative burden, we were explaining this in a room with a nonprofit board and leadership and staff leadership team. And as we were defining administrative burden, someone really simply put, I think you're talking about the squeeze factor. So we use squeeze factor now when describing this, and that meaning is the juice worth the squeeze. And we know that not all dollars are equal in our operating in our budget, that sometimes dollars are much more expensive than other dollars, and there's a real important need to consider that when assessing the different when exploring your optimal income mix, and giving folks who are involved in managing the dollars and raising the dollars and implementing the work through the dollars an opportunity to have discussion and assess the administrative burden of those dollars. This is all about considering your current and existing capabilities and infrastructure, and how well you are positioned to administer the certain types of income. The fourth income mix dynamic we use in this assessment is the opportunity. It's simply put the magnitude of funding, how likely or might this grow to what magnitude over time. This is similar to some terms you've heard from other speakers today on natural match. If this income source is a natural match for us, it might present a really significant opportunity, one that we simply can't say no to, or would be really reluctant to miss the opportunity. So it is in large parts about magnitude and also about the natural fit of the dollars. So we work with organizations and leaders to assess each income type across those four dynamics. Again, I'll emphasize the benefit of group discussion across those four dynamics. This is a facilitative framework, a facilitative tool, meaning it is meant to guide discussion towards a decision. And anytime you're working towards a decision around organizational strategy, financial strategy, there's always great benefit to engaging a group of folks who'll be tasked with implementing and affected by the result of that decision. So we've had really great effectiveness in engaging groups of nonprofit board and staff members together to share their own observations, their own scorings, and coming to some shared understanding around their organization's optimal income mix. And that's where I'll bring in my colleague, Jenny Metzler here. Jenny is the CEO at Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless. Really pleased to be joined by Jenny today. Jenny has gone through this exercise as a nonprofit leader. So I'm going to ask her a few questions that hopefully prompt Jenny to speak to her experience and the experience of HCH. So Jenny, would you just maybe start by setting the context a little bit as our case example, maybe talk about your org size, the major services of HCH, Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless, and the organization's approach to strategy and business planning?
So Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless is a federally qualified health center and a 501c3 nonprofit here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've about 40 years old. About 4 decades ago, we began in a little Airstream trailer with a health provider, social services provider, and a finance person out in the parking lots of shelters trying to figure out how to provide care to people without homes. We serve exclusively the unhoused population with an array today of health and social services. We do a lot through outreach. We have about a $13 million budget that was just approved by our board last night. They made us work very hard for it this year. And we have about 120 staff, I'd say right now, who are all kinds of professionals and paraprofessionals and administrators in the organization. And we're very, very wired to strategy until we started working with Michael. Several years ago, I said, in I think 3 planning cycles now, I said we always accomplished a lot strategically by pure tenacity. And then we learned that you really do have to allocate resources and make some decisions about how to support that from a business planning perspective. So we've been working with Michael since about 2016 on that, and we live it.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So HCH, in the context of business planning, went through this income mix assessment. You asked yourself that question of what is our optimal income mix? Would you talk a little bit about what HCH prioritized coming out of that assessment, out of those conversations, and why?
So we really looked at, I think one of the things that was very important to do was to clarify our definitions and our assumptions about dollars and revenue streams, and to really take a hard look at what our bread and butter had been and what had worked for us over the years. We're a very evolved, older organization. And so I think defining those principles, what's good money, what's bad money, what's soft money, just to plow through all that, really understand what had worked for us, what our foundation was, so that anything that we explored didn't crumple our core. And so then we went through a whole value-based, I think it's been explained really well here, but a series of matrices, conversations, to really dig into what was the lens that was most important for us for expansion and growth, for financial stability to support our mission. And then I think also what's aligned with our values and our commitment to equity, our commitment to addressing the structural determinants of health and homelessness. Really, we can get out of our comfort level, but just for the sake of getting out of our comfort level and generating more dollars was not what we were interested in. So we had to define the framework for our decision-making first, and I'll come to agreement.
Mm-hmm. Nice, thanks. Can you talk a little bit about the decision and direction to prioritize increased medical assistance billing?
Yeah, so we're definitely over 80% publicly funded, but that's 42 different grants and contracts that are federal, state, city, county, and then private philanthropic dollars as well. And we do have an expectation as a federally qualified health center that we don't turn people away because they can't pay or they're uninsured, which is our mission. But we also have to optimize all available revenues, including Medicaid and Medicare. So that's where we bill. And that's kind of philosophically a hard one for community health workers. And we had to do a little bit of organizational identity conversation and stretch to figure out how to optimize that. Because you don't have to have Medicaid to come here. We're all committed to access. But that was money that was sitting on the table that was really good to leverage, that was very flexible once we built it and got it to support building our bench. We have a very, very high compliance burden and administrative burden because we're so diversified with public contracts. But we felt like it was a really good one that we were leaving on the table. And so we had struggled to increase that. So we decided we were just going to really buckle down. And I'm happy to report that in the last quarter of this fiscal year that just ended, we exceeded our quarterly Medicaid billing revenues through this process and defining why it was important and how we were going to go about it.
Nice, thanks. Is there anything through the conversations around optimizing AHH's income mix that you deprioritized or walked away from certain types of income?
Yeah, we did. We have some local government contracts, and I won't identify whether it's city, state, or county, that were becoming increasingly high in administrative burden, increasingly fickle in their procurement and monitoring processes, and really sort of difficult to work with. But they were longtime funders. That was great money to tap into, but it was the net cost to us. And I'll say too that just the distress that it caused staff in the interactions to be able to really have good grant health on those contracts was getting exceedingly difficult. And with the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion in the state of New Mexico, there was a deep misunderstanding of Medicaid dollars to leverage with housing and other health dollars to address homelessness. And so they were building really unrealistic and not difficult to implement, if not impossible, contractual obligations about which funding dollar came first. The feds always come first. And so we were never going to be able to draw down money there. So we did actually step away. We didn't step away from anything quickly, drastically, or under duress. That's the other value of this process, is that we're scenario planning and then we're prioritizing and then we put it in motion, but we don't do it in a way that's going to be disruptive to our services, our care, or taking care of our employees.
Nice. Thanks, Jenny. Ruth, would the time be right to open up for any Q&A from attendees?
Absolutely. There's so much in what you said, Jenny, that I just, that resonated. And you used one term, which I thought was fascinating, which is the idea of not taking on anything that's going to crumple your core. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I feel like one of the things that we don't, when we deal with numbers, sometimes instead of just dealing with the numbers, we really have to think about what are the implications of those numbers on us. It's not only about the numbers, but it's about some other things as well. And one of the other things that you mentioned was the idea of one particular contract that you had really causing huge distress to staff. Can you just talk a little bit about those choices that you made and the values base that they kind of represented?
Yeah, thanks. So we have, this is kind of been a mantra for us for a long time that honestly and this is with a nod to smaller and maybe newer organizations. We've been around for a long time, and we always have to remember that. So we have this foundation that we've built very intentionally and strategically, but it's in some ways easy to go get new money because you have a shiny penny and you pitch it and you're excited about it. And then sustainability is a lot of what we're talking about here. And so sustaining that core, we say, if we are impeccable, then we can be bold and innovative. And our mission by nature is bold, innovative, and has risk implicit. We're providing healthcare in very, very uncontained settings, street medicine, backpack medicine, alleyways, and some other place without going into my opinion on shelters and whether they're safe places or not. But we have to incorporate and factor all those things into every decision we make about every funding stream, maintaining and also growing. And so we've actually codified and institutionalized a lot of this with flowcharts. Who makes the decisions? Who does that impeccable implementation? Who is accountable for the health of our grants and contracts? How are we monitoring that? Our board is very, very engaged in being accountable to that. And we have tools and measures and dashboards for all of that to keep an eye on it so that we're not inadvertently taking on something big and new, that our scale is deliberate and paced. That's built into the new business plan that we just completed. We actually put percentages on it and a cumulative total limit for the first time ever. Every time we do a big project like this planning, we use it as a vehicle for capacity building for our teams. And Michael knows we add, into his contract even one more element of what will help our financial sustainability and the capacity of our organization and our teams to just get better and better at this over time until our mission is moot. I think about the distress, I think, what can we handle? Where do we build our bench and our infrastructure with what kinds of resources? We do have a very, very healthy federally negotiated indirect cost rate. It feels like a lot of work to get it, but it is so worth it because a lot of those things that others won't fund or won't restrict to, because it's bad to fund anything except programs, but programs don't run themselves. So I think it's really worthwhile, and that gives us a lot of flexibility. But I think that's good for our teams. This work is hard enough. We don't need to be jumping through hoops. We don't need to be, focused more on the funders than we are our clients, because we're very person-centered in our model and our philosophy. So all of this is really about mission, model, philosophy of care. I think it's about equity for nonprofits. This is, one little stump speech, having been on a lot of boards and volunteered and working here. We just perpetuate a mindset of begging or always being on the edge or not being able to pay our teams well or make value-based decisions in our business practices. And, over time this builds, and it gives us a stronger position to fulfill our missions and not be so beholden, because that itself is traumatic.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it speaks to what we've heard from our community from the beginning, is that all of these decisions really do have emotional and equity implications. They do. They reflect the identity that you want. Or don't, and to sometimes your losses. And I'd like for you to talk to just one more thing. I think we could talk for a long time about this one model. I think it's very interesting. But a lot of organizations experience pressure from their boards never to leave a dollar on the table, so-called, to always be exploring new revenue sources so that there's a bigger reserve in the organization. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. You just now took us back to the getting good at what you're doing, which is the indirect cost rate for you, and really being able to optimize the value of the dollar there. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the cost benefit thoughts that you have about either editing sources down or adding sources? And either one of you, Michael, I know you've thought about a lot about this as well. How do you walk through those decisions? Because it's not like you can open up new revenue streams with no cost involved and no risk involved.
Maybe I'll offer one quick comment that's kind of how to set that conversation up, maybe in a boardroom or around a leadership table. And I think it's oftentimes helpful to decouple financial scale and mission impact as perfectly related, because there's lots of ways to increase your mission impact without increasing your financial scale, and it can be uncomfortable. There's the tenets of capitalism are very entrenched in our sector, in our boardrooms, and there's oftentimes just an assumption that if you aren't growing, you're perishing. And then there's ways to increase mission impact through strategy processes, through financial strategy considerations, increase organizational health and capacity that don't necessarily imply or require financial growth. So I'd offer that general framing. And then Jenny, if you have any specific examples from HCH on this point.
Yeah, I was actually going to throw it back to you on the process that we've developed for business planning. Our board is, I believe in, I know a lot of boards, people don't always appreciate them, but I think boards, a community health center board is representative of the community, and that they hold me and the team and the organization accountable. And so we train the snot out of our boards, and they know exactly why, and we're very transparent, and we create dashboards that are useful to them to match that training, and they're engaged in all of this. So we had Michael's process, and what we've done is we put together ad hoc work groups around our strategic and business planning, and we had one focused on this revenue model, and one of the tools we created out of that we had and refined with board input is a funding. Every time we look at a funding application or proposal or a new funding stream, we have a screen, and it incorporates equity, it incorporates cost benefit. Maybe the bottom line is for our Art Street Open Studio project, that $5,000 pain in the butt grant, we have a $13 million budget, but to get that grant puts the seal of the state cultural affairs division on our little program that leverages so much for people without homes to be in a community space and make art. It's very therapeutic, it's very integrated. And so that might not look like a good investment of our time to generate those $5,000. But for now, the social capital, I did read the articles, but the social capital of that relationship in the community is really important for building the program and for our public policy and our community engagement and education about the experience of homelessness and turning around stigma. So we have a screen that, and our board said through this last process, this is a good screen, now use it. And we want to know it's documented every single file for every funding stream that your teams look at generating or maintaining. So, we've just codified it and really built it in.
I love this, Jenny, and I'm going to put a picture of you up on our website under the statement, we train the snot out of our board. Just to remind people that that's absolutely necessary to have rational discussions
They just all got a little chill up their spine.
About business models. So I appreciate that a lot. And thank you so much for being here today and for sharing this. It's really fascinating. We'll be following up on all of this, but as people can tell in listening to this, it is very, all of these decisions are very unique to your organization, and they're not easily dealt with a broad brush. These are really a series of choices that require discussions. And it also requires a sense of owning budgets and funding and all of that together, and understanding what those implications are. And with that, I'm going to go on. Thank you so much, Jenny, for being here.
I think we might have lost Ruth. So I'm going to just go ahead and speak before we end with some final considerations. So hello, my name is Dana Brito. I am a moderator for the Nonprofit Financial Commons team. I am also, in my larger professional gig, I do financial management consulting for nonprofits and have been in the space for the past 18 or so years. And so I think if this presentation has taught you anything, is that I think there's obviously, given the pros and cons that have come up around diversification, not just in the research and the best practices, but also I think in some of the lived experiences that Jenny talked through, planning and due diligence is key, and making sure that you are doing that in as robust a way as possible is something to think about, and really some final thoughts we want to close out with in that regard. So I think anytime you are generating or receiving money from new sources, you are entering into a situation where you will inevitably need to successfully build and maintain trust with those new donors or new sources of revenue. And so part of that trust is doing the due diligence, doing the necessary assessments and doing the necessary planning to make sure that you're not just identifying what sources are working for you and which sources, importantly, are not, to Ruth's point around editing, but also how to maintain and execute those revenue generating strategies over time. So in terms of the due diligence, obviously there's some, as we've been talking about, there's some level of research and benchmarking that should be done as part of even making the decisions around which revenue sources you want to pursue, never mind actually executing those strategies. So I think, for example, a lot of arts organizations, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, haven't necessarily seen their audiences return to pre-pandemic levels, and so are exploring both in addition to and beyond just traditional performance-based ticket income, what other types of earned revenue, maybe through workshops or other educational programming or through some other type of consultancy fees through which their work is used in partnership with other organizations or corporations to generate some type of fee for service income. Um, Really thinking about your sector, the sector that you're in, understanding primary revenue drivers like we talked about within the sector, but talking to people who have embarked on new revenue, new revenue generation strategies or new revenue streams, getting a sense of what that did to their budget, what it did to, again, to the psychology of staff, to Jenny's point around that being a factor that you're thinking about, what it did to the type of systems that you needed, and really being thoughtful about the market dynamics. And I think especially we think about it in the context of earned income, but even as it relates to the wonkiness of institutional funders who have strategic priorities for a couple of years and then they drastically change, really being thoughtful about how you're thinking and doing research on the external environment and using that to benchmark progress in your revenue strategies, and also using it to help develop and determine which resources and which sources of revenue are most critical to your mission impact and your ongoing sustainability. I think outside of the external assessment, there really needs to be a really rigorous and thoughtful understanding and look at your own business model and your own capital needs. And so, starting with the latter, in a lot of our webinars and our sessions, we've talked a lot about the concept of liquid unrestricted net assets. So really the flexible funding that's there, really to cover your day to day expenses and is there to provide support for your operations. And then in addition to that, you may need additional reserves that act as either a line of credit or a rainy day fund. It's really that capital, and really understanding that is really critical to understanding what runway you have in terms of investing in new revenue sources, and how long that runway looks like as it relates to getting to a point where investing in the new revenue source eventually, if ever, breaks even. So there's a really solid understanding of really understanding your own balance sheet, understanding liquidity, especially, and understanding access to reserves. That absolutely needs to come into play when thinking about your risk tolerance and your ability to invest in new revenue opportunities. And part of understanding that runway is really doing the actual projections. Jenny mentioned scenario planning, which I think is something, conversations around both of those things, I think we'll probably, again, not to make any promises, but we'll probably have to revisit in future conversations from the Commons, because it's so important, not just from an annual operations perspective, but for especially if you're investing in any type of new venture or new opportunity, you really need to understand the levers of money coming in, money going out, what parts of what programs and what departments are subsidizing each other or not, and really understanding at what point would this new proposition become break even or profitable, if ever, and really being thoughtful about sort of the monitoring process around that, which I'll talk a little bit about, and particularly in the context of the board. And then I think finally, the board is not, to Ruth's point, you definitely hear a lot of stories of boards pressuring organizations not to leave money on the table. But beyond that pressure, they also need to be involved and really responsible and accountable for assessing and understanding the risks, and thinking about which metrics are most critical to understanding and assessing those risks over time. Next slide, Hilda. So I think in addition to being, I guess, the champions of thinking about and maximizing revenue, it also needs to be measured and countered with understanding the risks and the capacities and infrastructure involved whenever you're thinking about generating new revenue sources. And I think, again, to the point that Michael made, there are ways to maximize and ensure mission impact without growth and without chasing dollars, especially if those dollars could lead to any type of mission drift or lack of focus and jeopardization of your organizational impact. So making sure that board members are not just identifying potential sources of new revenue, but are really being thoughtful and intentional and robust in their participation in the assessment of those risks. So we talked a lot about understanding this difference throughout the entire business model series. We've talked a lot about the different skills, capacities, and capabilities that are tied to each of these types of revenue sources. And I think the board needs to be not just trained on that, but also champions in advancing the fact that and making sure that you're thinking as comprehensively as possible about the risks tied to it. So for government funding, again, thinking about the risks tied to it, especially in this political climate, are certain causes going to, are certain mission areas going to be more adhered to the typical or the current administration? How are changes in administration? How is the election going to impact government funding? Or again, even foundation funding. Again, we talked about and have seen in the chat sort of how certain funders have completely and drastically changed their strategic direction. And so thinking about those risks and also thinking about particularly if you're going after administrative heavy sources like government funding, making sure you have the systems, making sure that you have the compliance culture and structures, making sure you understand and are dotting your I's and checking your and crossing your T's in terms of making sure that you have the systems and the practices and policies and procedures in place to make sure that those vouchers are as accurate as possible, given the notorious delays that are tied with that type of funding. You also want to involve the board typically and similar to how Jenny did with her board in understanding what's necessary. What is that runway for yielding a positive return if there is ever a positive return? If there isn't ever a positive return, how else are we subsidizing our investment in this new revenue source? And is it critical to our mission impact going forward, and using them and informing the assumptions behind whatever projections or scenario modeling that you're doing? And then also to Jenny's point, making sure the board is involved in monitoring your progress against these goals and against your success in executing new revenue strategies. So Jenny had mentioned having a dashboard available, or what I think it's dashboards. It's making sure that they're involved in understanding and identifying what are your key performance indicators. If you're going after individual donors, is it number of outreaches? Is it number of emails? Is it number of coffees in terms of developing new revenue or new relationships with donors? How are you assessing your progress against goals? And also at what point, especially based on your capital structure and your available capital and resources, at what point do you need to recalibrate to make sure that you are not jeopardizing not just the mission impact of the organization, but the long-term financial sustainability? So again, I think I'll leave you with the points of, I think if this presentation taught you anything, I think the due diligence that needs to happen and really should be spearheaded with leadership and alongside the board is critical in making sure that you're doing that due diligence, not just in the context of the external environment, but also are really robustly understanding the ins and outs of your current business model and what the impact of a new revenue source will have on both your financial performance and the operational and infrastructural needs to successfully execute it in the future. And so with that, I will hand it off to Amanda to close us out.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you to all of our presenters today, especially our guest presenters, Jenny and Michael, our own moderators of NFC, Dana and Mark, and of course to Hilda and her team at BDO for taking us through this business model series. If you did not have a chance to see any of the other business model series, or if you want to just refresh and rewatch them, please head over to our website, and on our homepage, you will see all the course area for all of those webinars and the resources that go along with them. If you have any questions that you had in the chat or that you didn't have time to ask in the chat or we didn't answer, you can still ask those questions in our forum, which is located on our website as well. When you go over to the forum, you'll be able to post your questions, and you can also head over there and answer other questions from other people in the NFC community. So the link for that was dropped in the chat, so you can head over to our website and to the forum if you would like to continue this conversation there. The last thing that I would like to ask is that you are an important integral part of our community at Nonprofit Financial Commons, and we rely on our community a lot, not only for knowledge, but to keep us going. So if you received value from the webinar today or any of the webinars that were in the business model series, please, if you can, take the time to make a donation today. The link is in the chat, and there is also a QR code located on the screen.